Hello everyone, Charles Coleman here, presenting to you a little lecture I was involved with recently in upstate New York in the promotion of a concert produced by Garage at Chatham. This concert's happening at Cady's Hall in Chatham, New York on Saturday, July 13th, 2024. Odds are if you're watching this video on 2136, you probably missed it. But if you happen to catch this before July 13th, 2024, there's this concert involving two pieces, one of which I wrote entitled Quartet for a New Start, to be followed by the classic work of Quartet for the End of Time by Olivier Messiaen, his first quote-unquote hit, a work that he wrote while he was a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany in 1941. Basically, he befriended a few other instrumentalists that happened to be there, and he wrote this amazing work called Quartet for the End of Time. And so I was commissioned by Garage at Chatham to write a companion work to Messiaen's classic, and I called it Quartet for a New Start. So kind of poetic. But before that, we did a little pre-concert get-together in promotion of this concert at the Bill Arning Exhibitions Gallery. I believe it's in Kinderhook, New York, just outside Chatham. And we did this little lecture in promotion of this concert in which I got to talk about my piece, Quartet for a New Start, along with talking about me and, how I evolved through the music world subsequently to promote this upcoming piece. Just to let you know, the audio in this lecture is a little bit boomy, but I believe I was able to create the audio in a way that is very understandable. Let me know in the comments, and if there needs to be any clarification, please let me know. The concert for which we did this lecture, as I said, was going to be at Cady's Hall on Saturday, July 13th, 2024, will involve some great musicians, including Emile Anne Gendron on violin, I hope I pronounced that name right, along with Chris Gross on cello, Bixby Kennedy on clarinet, and Taka Kigawa on piano. Taka and I have worked a number of times together, wonderful pianist. He's done many concerts in New York City, and he and all these other musicians will be involved in Chatham, New York in this concert. Anyway, this pre-concert lecture at the Bill Arning Exhibitions Gallery was moderated by my dear friend Carlo Bo, a wonderful conductor, composer, and pianist that I've worked with for many years. He is the music director of Garage at Chatham. And, well, take a look for yourself. I hope you enjoy this great lecture that we did.
So Charlie, let's first of all tell people, Charlie is one of the people who has one of the most eclectic and capacious and ears I know, and I always prided myself on knowing a lot of music, but whenever I was out with Charlie, I could never play that card because he was almost 6 times better at it.
No comment.
Yes, but Charlie, so you came to your eclecticism very early, and you are, for somebody who's a modern American composer, you started in a place which people might think might be a little out of sync, which is that you were an employee of the Metropolitan Opera.
Kinda. I was in the children's chorus of the Metropolitan Opera circa a little bit years ago. And that was pretty much where it all started, the music. Pretty much where the whole music thing started. My first job was in the actually, it was at the Metropolitan Opera, but it was the Berlin Ballet that came to the Met, and they did the Nutcracker, Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, and I sang in the children's chorus in the orchestra pit that ends Act 1, the snowflakey thing. I remember Rudolf Nureyev was Drosselmeyer, so that was my first ever musical gig ever.
And how old were you?
I think it was 11.
There you go.
Something like that.
So we're ahead of you, man.
Yeah.
But you also told me, we were just swapping stories the other day, and we were talking about the first piece of classical music where we went, uh-oh. think that's it for me. You first heard it.
Well, the first version was Tosca.
Yeah.
It was, my mom was watching it on PBS. I think it was the film version, 1979, with Raina Kavajvanska, Placido Domingo, and Cheryl Milnes. And they filmed it. The opera Tosca takes place at certain locations that exist today in Rome. So in the film version, they actually filmed it at these locations. And my mom was watching it, and I remember hearing these amazing back and forth chords in the middle of near the end of the first act. And I was listening from the back room doing my homework, and I came out to check it out, and I was blown away. It was the end of the Te Deum that ends the first act. And well, the thing about it was that I don't know whether Mom intended it for me. You know, usually when a proud parent wants to shove their kids in front of the TV and show them something they love, that kids are not usually interested in it. So I came out of my own accord to watch this telecast of Tosca on TV, and I feel if she shoved me in front of the TV, I wouldn't have been interested, because you want to rebel in some way. But I was hooked. It's just an amazing, glorious thing that ends the first act of Tosca, and I was hooked ever since.
Yeah, and at that time, did you have any idea that you would one day sing the shepherd part? Did you sing the shepherd part?
I did. I did. At the
Right.
It was the old Tito Gobi production.
And who was conducting?
When I knew it was Giuseppe Patane.
Oh, of course. Yeah, one of the great old
Yeah.
school conductors.
Very friendly to me. I've read that he was a tough guy to deal with in rehearsal, but he was always cool. The time that we had, he was cool with me, and and I got to do it with Cheryl Milnes as Scarpia, and I think both Jose Carreras and Giuseppe Giacomini alternated the part of Cavaradossi.
Right.
And I got to hang in the back during the second act, where, if you know the opera, the tenor's being tortured. And occasionally, when Carreras did it, he would have a member of the chorus do the yelling part for him. He'd be singing from backstage, but as far as the yelling parts, he would give it to a tenor in the chorus.
Right.
But occasionally, Carreras would say, "Okay, I'll yell this one out," like 5 bars before they would go on stage. But that's how he did it. So. But I was a shepherd boy in the chorus.
And you were also, weren't you one of the sprites in the Magic Flute?
I was in the old Marc Chagall production. That was another highlight for me.
Yeah. And of course, you would have probably been in the children's chorus of Carmen.
Virtually any opera that has a children's chorus in it, I was in.
Right. So your early ear is full of the traditional operas, but that extended also to the Wagner operas, which I know you eventually became a big lover of the Wagner operas.
Despite the person that he supposedly was, yes.
Yeah. So let's move up a little. So when was the first time you started to think, and what was the music that started to push you towards writing? What wanted you, like American classical composer? What made you say, I'm going to be an American classical composer?
It kind of started in my children's chorus days, when I would always be, we would be in our room in the Met Opera, I think room 205. We'd be listening to the opera through the monitor, and I don't know, I found myself critiquing whether that note should have been a D flat or a C sharp, or some D flat or C sharp at the same note,
That's a good ear, if you can tell us.
Yeah, but I kept critiquing, and some kids thought it was cool that I was so into the opera that I would be critiquing that chord or that melody. And some jerk came up to me and said, "What do you know? You're not even a composer." How old were you? I must have been 11, 12, something like that. So I thought, okay, let me give it a shot. And I knew I wanted to compose because, when your voice changes, it's a bit of a crapshoot as to whether you have a singing voice as an adult. So that's pretty much when I started writing and realized that I had something to say for myself, so I might as well utilize it. And so here I am.
Yeah. And so you went to Manhattan School of Music?
Yep.
And
Well, before that, I went to the Turtle Bay Music School, which, by the way, was the first time I heard the Messiaen Quartet that we'll be hearing
the
next
pieces
week.
that the GAC is going to be performing next week.
When I was in high school, the high school had a partnership with the Turtle Bay Music School,
Right.
and that's roughly where I learned my basics about harmony and form analysis and stuff like that. So, and then it was there that there was a concert of the quartet for the other time.
So that's new to me. So
yeah.
So do you remember the experience of that?
Very much so. It was the first Messiaen piece I ever heard, and I was, there's some weird moments. I found it weird, but it was intriguing nonetheless. And there's very tonal moments, very dissonant moments, very laid back moments, very in-your-face moments, all within I guess the whole piece is what, about 45 minutes to an hour?
Yeah, an average performance is about 52 minutes.
Yeah, but it was a Turtle Bay Music School that I heard some of the first few of my heroes, composers, like Messiaen and a few others. So, but then eventually I went to high school music.
Right, and I know that's where a lot of the people that we intersect with met. Some of my studies were with somebody who was,
John Paulo Baracali, I believe.
Yeah, John Paulo Baracali, who was my conducting teacher as well. And that's where you met Gene Pritzker, and also you met, is that where you started your relationship with the artists?
Yes, that would be it. Well, Gene Pritzker and Christian Yerby formed a group called Absolute Ensemble, a chamber orchestra. Basically, they were kind of going into it right in their last years of college, and they asked me to be involved, and I've been there ever since. So
yeah,
they needed an extra singer / composer to arrange, and I'm like, well, I guess the Philadelphia Orchestra is not interested in me right now. This is a gig. So Christian told me, you can apply to any of the orchestras if you want, but I promise you this: you give me a piece, I'll play it. That was his pitch.
Right, and the Yerbys, of course, are one of the venerable sort of families of music. I mean, they're not, 3 generations, 4, and they're all conductors. They all are in the family businesses.
The 3 guys, Damien Yerby's older brother, Viola, was the one that kind of started the business.
Yeah.
But then, subsequently, the two sons, there's their daughter, daughter Marika, who's a phenomenal flautist, who I've also gotten to work with, and now I think there's still a younger generation of mostly instrumentalists and stuff like that. But those are the top guys.
Yeah, and Charlie and I forget where exactly we met, but there was a couple of years where, Charlie has a good baritone voice, and he had written an opera that I conducted the premiere of. But you also sang one of the parts. You sang the baritone part in your own opera.
Apparently I had to do that. And I remember when I wrote this one-act opera called Redemption, which Tom Bo conducted, and I remember thinking, I use the old formula, in your average opera, you've got the soprano, the tenor, and the baritone leads, and usually she wants the tenor, she doesn't want the baritone. As Cheryl Mills once said, baritones are the trois in the menage a trois. Well, and of course then Lou Rogers, who ran the company we did with, Golden Fleece Limited, asked me to sing in my own opera, which I wasn't planning to. But what really made me annoyed was that one of the sopranos we worked with, who was the lead soprano, was gorgeous, and the director made her and the tenor make out. Damn it! I didn't get to make out in my own opera.
You should have been in a different opera.
I should have, but I didn't. Well, I didn't know I was going to be in it. But
well, the second one, you can correct that.
Maybe.
And then when I did it, I think that when I wrote my short opera the next year, I tried to make sure Charlie had a great high G to sing.
And I think you specified the vowel. It was a nice open vowel. Damn.
I put it on the word damn.
Which is the perfect vowel to sing a high note in.
Well, I didn't want Charlie.
It felt right. So, but when we actually met, I think you and I, the time we met was when we did Gene's opera.
That's right.
Cheaters.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
that was when we actually worked together for the first time, and
right. That was a nice thing. It was nice for me. I got for about 10.
Du bon passants cheaters.
Yeah.
That was
Charlie has been since the beginning, but there's a group in Manhattan called Composers Concordance, and I was in and out of that for a series of about 10 years. So it was great. Everybody got to play. Everybody got to perform.
Everyone got along.
Yeah, it was like a consortium. So Charlie, let's get a little bit. So since we started the garage at Chatham, I've always had my eye on performing the Messiaen, because it's such a seminal piece. I think it's one of the few pieces that is unequivocally esteemed by every musician and composer as one of the great pieces of the 20th century. And it has such an interesting history, of course, being written in a concentration camp and for very specific musicians. And of course with Messiaen, always each piece is a kind of a meditation on the biblical text. Each of the movements of the Quartet for the End of Time is a meditation on these texts. So it's a very specific and very spiritual piece of music. So I wanted to have a companion piece for it, and I thought Charlie would be the one to write it. So I'm just very curious if we can get a little bit in the process here. So when I called you up and asked you if you wanted to do it, and knowing that it would be a piece of about 8 to 10 minutes and it would be for the same instrumentation, what were the first things you started thinking of that you wanted to achieve, like either in terms of mood, in terms of tribute to the piece? Because a little bit you said, maybe I'll quote some of the pieces from Messiaen.
I ended up not doing that directly, but conceptually, I compared the circumstances that he wrote that piece in to my circumstances, which of course I had no idea what it's like to be in a prisoner of war camp, not knowing whether you'd be executed the next day or not, which I'm sure he was thinking. So thus he wrote that. I think he wrote a few other pieces besides that. That's the main one that he wrote. So as far as I was concerned, I wanted to utilize what I feel. We're depending on what political side you're on. I found myself looking for whatever solace I could get in any tough situation, which I think is roughly what he was doing, looking beyond the atmosphere. And I also looked at a few other guys that did that. Robert Falcon Scott, the guy that second person to go to the South Pole, who unfortunately he and his crew died along the way back to the camps. But if you read his journal, he was talking about how he and his boys, how they were looking at how they were all polite to each other and they were all good-hearted no matter how bad things got. And I admired him for having that kind of an attitude in the worst circumstances. And same with, I was just recently looking at Anne Frank's diary, who, even though she and Scott died, they were still looking beyond their personal circumstances and looking for the good in everything, no matter how bad things got. Same with Messiaen, obviously, and he survived. So I want to do something not exactly the same, but in a subliminal kind of way, looking beyond the circumstances. I'm not a very political person, even though I am a left-minded kind of guy. But I found myself wanting to write a piece that could somehow smile amidst a time of hardship. It starts off, my piece, Quartet for a New Start, which by the way is a little pun on the other piece, Quartet for the End of Time. Quartet for a New Start seemed poetic for me. It starts out where you hear, I guess, a sense of struggle, but eventually evolves into a more solace-ridden type of atmosphere beyond the hardship. And I guess a lot of my pieces in general that I've been writing over the last few years were kind of trying to utilize that.
So is that specifically reflected in the structure of the piece? Did you specifically decide to create like for example, slow music that would accelerate towards a climax. How does that sort of psychological point of view reveal itself in the structure?
It doesn't start out slow. It has it's more tense in the beginning, and there are a few chordal and motivic things that kind of maneuver as the piece develops. Not something that you necessarily hear directly, but except for a couple of chordal moments that start the piece and that end the piece.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
So it's in a different light later on, different from how it started. So that's one way to.
Charlie has a talent for creating rhythms that overlap and ebb and flow, but are part of a real structure. And I was always impressed, like in your opera, I was always a fan of the trio, one of the big musical climaxes of his opera. And what I was a fan of was how the elements slowly came in, but there was a logic and a coalescence. And you managed to create kind of like a structural crescendo in 4 or 5 minutes. And as a composer, I remember again thinking, damn, I wish I could do that. So I know, to me, structure is an enormous part of how you think, and like what Nadia Boulanger would have called the great line, the grand arc of the piece.
Sure.
Am I making that?
No, actually what happened, that scene, so there's a section in the middle of this opera that he conducted called Redemption, where three characters have lost their loved ones, and then these three same characters meet up, and in the middle they sing about how much they're in love with each other. And I needed to write a trio segment. I remembered watching Stephen Sondheim's Little Night Music, where there's a similar trio.
Right.
Basically, they sing about their mood, and then after the three of them do it individually, the three of them make a trio out of it, and they overlap each other.
So there's a natural crescendo in the structure.
Yeah,
right.
I suppose.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to replicate that, and I told my librettist John Roberts, he had not written the scene yet. I felt we needed a moment in the opera where the three characters sing about how happy they are, because he didn't write that. And he asked me, well, can you give me an example where that works? And I showed him the Sondheim Little Night Music, and he said, okay, that's fine. And he wrote it for me in a day. So.
I find always that, especially if the librettists of operas come to it from a more literary background, it's always astonishing to them when they see how the music itself can be the structure. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? How the music can provide a structure that the libretto then almost has to follow.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, John, what I love, if you notice, in your average opera in general, there isn't a lot of dialogue in comparison to, say, a play, because they're singing. When they sing, it's at a slower pace than when you speak.
Right, the information.
So you're in your average opera libretto, you have to get to the point quicker.
Yeah.
In order to be able to do it in a certain amount of time. And John Roberts, who wrote the libretto of this opera, he was very good at getting to the point very quickly. Even though we had to trim a few things, maybe add a few things, which is what all composers and librettists do with each other. And we got along for the most part. I don't think we ever had a fight. I've heard stories of arguments between Richard Strauss and Hugo Hofmannsthal. And
you know what I would have wanted to see would be Richard Wagner having a fight with himself. Because he was Rosenberg.
Right.
That I would pay to see.
Yeah. Well, he was conflicted in general, I would say.
I would say.
But it made for great art.
Yeah. So then, say anything more you want about like the piece that's coming up on the concert, because you imagined it. Did you imagine it in this context, or did you imagine? In other words, Charlie's piece is going to be a prelude to the Messiaen. So did you imagine, for example, did knowing it would precede it, and the way, for example, influence the way you ended the piece, so that the last music we heard of yours would be the first music heard before the Messiaen?
Very subliminally. I mean, I know of the Messiaen, of course, but I appreciate, as I said before, Messiaen was looking beyond his personal circumstances when he wrote that. So I wanted to do something similar. And because I know that grew up with the piece, I guess I wanted to provide something that would work with it. I was originally thinking of taking quotes from the Messiaen, but I decided not to. It didn't seem necessary. I mean, the instrumentation, the fact that it's the same instrumentation is in itself an effective tool. But I wanted to see what he was going for in over a 40, 50-minute period, what I can do similarly within a 10-minute period. Not the same thing, but maybe overall conceptually looking for that sunflower amidst a swamp of indifference.
Oh my God.
I should copyright that.
So that's going to be the title of the video.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think little pitch for the concert. We've got some really, really good players. Taka, the pianist, he's played other music.
He's played a couple of.
Taka Kigawa is the pianist for next week.
Amazing. One of the best musicians I've ever worked with. Taka. Yeah. He did.
Low-key guy, but goddamn, he's
simple, likable guy.
But yeah, simple, but not. You play like that, there's other stuff going on.
But a very likable guy, even though he's a genius pianist. He did a solo piano work of mine and a song cycle I wrote for Mezzo Soprano years ago. And just one of my, and I think I may have performed with him a few. I've known him for a while, and he's one of my favorite people to work with. And I remember he did concerts of. I think he did all the Chopin preludes, like the whole band.
A couple, Andy here, we'll break the fourth wall a little bit. Andy here has been to a couple of Taka's concerts, and he's
they don't get better than him.
Yeah, and he did a concert that was just preludes and etudes, and it was Messiaen, Debussy, and Chopin. So.
And he's a nice guy. Your average genius musician is not so nice.
Yeah,
so
he's a lovely man. Yeah. So we're looking forward to having him.
Yeah.
But I think we're also very fortunate in that when I knew when he was available and he wanted to do this, I let him bring in the musicians he wanted to bring in because I trusted him to bring in some of the top people.
Sure.
So, point to the possible viewer on the internet. Go to garagechatham.com and you'll see who we brought in, and I hope it will entice you to come to the concert.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's before we ask the people to interrogate you, tell me about. Let me just name some composers and maybe some contemporary American composers and maybe some of the older ones, and maybe tell me if there's anything about their music and be specific musically. Like these people. They're clever enough, and they're all artists. They believe me. They understand the process. So, do you find your music ever influenced by, for example, Sam Barber?
Sure. Well, certainly the lyricism. The Barber. I think like everyone else, the first piece I ever heard was the Barber Adagio. And it's what I love about that piece. It's arguably his most famous work. It was used in a few movies, and it's essentially the whole thing is an ascending scale. There's no melody. There's not even a melody in that, and yet, based on the harmony and this ascending melody that goes up, then skips and goes up, and sort of. And with these chords, it's just amazing how simple structurally that is. And that work made me think, well, my music arguably is not nearly as simple as that. I've subliminally applied that to anything I write as a means to not try and add too much and just be careful of what is worth hearing, and what people may not hear will be subliminal. Kind of like the background of a painting, let's say.
Well, if I can add to, I think there's one element of music that I keep coming back to as I experience it more and get older and hear more music. And that is this sense of what you're talking about, and a little bit what I talked about before, which is that the structure is like always operating in maybe the place you call the subliminal place, like where you've been, where you're going. And I think in great music that it's always there, it's always implied, that kind of architecture in the background, leading you places, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, I know that the barber is like one long line to those beautiful sustained chords, right? Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So we're doing the highlights, and we were just listening to some on the way in. Yeah. So what about somebody like Leonard Bernstein? What about his music?
Obvious influence to me. If God willing, if I ever get to play the role, if there's any role I want to play, it's a celebrant in his mass. Yeah. Not only because it's such a great, crazy vocal part, but also the story. If you've ever seen the mass, basically it's about this guy called the celebrant trying to run a mass service while he is constantly being interrupted by a bunch of people that question whether believing in God is a good thing or not, and they start to ask all these questions, and then they get aggressive and more aggressive. They tear down the whole church, and then the celebrant has this meltdown where he takes the chalice and throws it to the floor, and Verdi has this amazing 15-minute meltdown where he reflects on all of their verbal abuse, and it all comes out. I'm not a religious person at all. I'm an agnostic, pretty much, and yet I feel more affinity with that character than any other I've ever looked at or played, even though we come from very opposite places. So the fact that I admire the fact that Bernstein wrote this amazing work where no matter where he is from, we can identify with him in any way. So that piece, of course, the score to the film, the one film score they wrote. That's the one. Oh God, I'm having a brain fart on that film. On the waterfront. Yeah. Which he made into a amazing 20-minute
orchestra.
That's
one of his, to me, that's his favorite orchestra.
Yeah.
The orchestra suite he created from On the Waterfront.
Yeah. I want to conduct that desperately, and I want to play the celebrant in his mass. Those are my two go-to pieces. So.
Well, but on the other hand, I mean, I'm an atheist myself, but I have a lot in common with religious people who have made a different decision than I am, but who have thought deeply about it. Mm. And I think the common thread might be struggling with the thinking of it, because the serious people have to consider those things. Mm. So maybe that's the common thread between the two.
Which makes me think that piece was one of the things that made me think about because I know a lot of people who I am not politically agree with so much, but I believe in agreeing to disagree, and I find that there's not a lot of that going on right now, or if it is, I don't see it. So,
well, about the 11. So let's get to some of the dudes who are out there now, or shall we say maybe elder statesmen. So, like for example, we were talking earlier on the way over here about John Corigliano, who you finally met last week.
I met last week at a party. Last Monday was Canada Day, and a violinist friend of mine who's from, I think she's from Montreal. She lives in New York and has an annual Canada Day party at her place every June 1st. Anyway, her name is Laura St. John, wonderful violinist, who recorded, I think John Corigliano made a suite out of his film score, The Red Violin, which made into a violin concerto. And so John was there, and I got to talk to him a little bit, and I told him that when I was in college, I was at the premieres of some of his pieces, and I told him half jokingly, "You're kind of good at this, aren't you?" And he said to me, "Well, I used to be."
So let's get on to Corigliano's greatness and fantastic.
Absolutely.
So maybe we'll hit one last one, and then maybe we'll let these guys ask you questions, or you just say some stuff you wanted to say. interesting composer because he is, to me, somebody who's started under sort of the rubric of a minimalist, but has never stopped evolving, and that's John Adams.
Sure. John, I love the fact that his son is also a composer, and he named him Sam Adams. That's just John's sense of humor. I met John several times over the years. One day I was backstage at New York State Theater. The New York City Ballet did a concert of his music. My buddy Christian Yerby, who you saw was there, and Christian introduced the two of us, and Christian said, this is Charles Coleman, great American composer, and John shook my hand saying, my condolences. But John is arguably, among many, the most influential composer for me when I started out, adding extra elements to a particular genre called minimalism, which has its pluses and its minuses. You know, there's, as John would say, the emotional bandwidth is kind of small in minimalism. So John, through a few pieces, notably a work he wrote called Harmonie Lera, 45-minute piece for orchestra.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
There's a lot of, apparently John had been listening to a lot of Wagner, and he thought, what if I could put the two together? So he wrote this piece called Harmonie Lera. Obviously it's more complicated than that, but that was the genesis for what made him want to write that. And I appreciate that music could do that. So if I'm influenced by anybody, it's primarily beyond the famous dead guys. It would probably be John Adams. So.
Well, it's interesting too because the premise of minimalism, of course, and I'm guessing everybody has a sense of what that sounds like. You know, the little repetition of little things that grow into bigger things, and so the structure tends to be sexual. Would you say? Tends to be additive.
Sure.
Yeah. But it's also a structure that can play out over a fair amount of time. Mm-hmm. So like the processes in one piece, like in the Steve Reich, the music for what was it, 18 musicians?
Yeah.
Those pieces are, you can create, I keep coming back to the details, like you can create interesting 8 and 10 and 12 minute arcs of sound which move in certain ways, and the architecture is almost the principal element.
Well, Steve Reich is also another influence. It's funny to look at what he's writing now, still writing good stuff. Back then, music for 18 musicians, the harmony usually sits there.
It tends to be a variation of one chord.
But now he's definitely modulates a hell of a lot more than he did before, and it's still good. Mind you, I'm partial, but I admire composers that are able to utilize something, and I don't know whether I don't know if we composers are conscious in how we develop, like in our 30s as we are in our 50s. If we do anything different later on, are we conscious of it? Are we not? I don't know the answer to that. So.
I think it's always some of both. Right?
Yeah.
I'll tell an anecdote that you can edit out. I remember about 10 years ago when I was sort of writing these things that were sort of jazz, sort of classical. Anyway, I came up with a tune that was like a minor chord, but it like just banged on the 9. The 9 chord. Oh, this is cool. And did this and did this. And so I'm going to put this away. I'll come back to it later. And like 2 or 3 years later, I don't know where, I heard a recording of Carlo Nocturne. I had just somehow remembered Carlo Nocturne, wrote it, and I thought it was and I thought, oh, we're going to do that.
I did
that.
Last year, I was involved in a jazz influence concert promoted by Composers Concordance in New York City, and I was asked if I could write a jazz influence piece, and I love jazz, but I'd never written for jazz really, and at first I didn't want to do it. And then I remember that 30 years ago I heard a melody from a song by Pat Metheny, and I didn't know what the song was, and I had not heard that melody since. And it's a melody that goes do 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 do, and I just simply, when I thought of that melody, I already figured out what the piece was. I wrote the piece in 3 days, and that melody goes all the way through this is a quintet that I wrote for strings which which I called Still Searching, because I'm searching for where that melody comes from, that Pat Metheny wrote.
There you go.
I still to this day have not figured out where that melody is from.
Did his lawyer call you and tell you where you got it from?
I put on a score based on a Pat Metheny melody, so I think that I solved the problem.
Listen, Charlie, I would sit here and talk shop with you for the next 7 or 8 hours, but I don't know if anybody has anything they want to ask Charlie in particular or about next week's
I have
concert.
a question. I don't think there's an answer to it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there more borrowing in music than there is in everything?
Not consciously. Borrowing?
Borrowing. You were talking about borrowing.
Yeah. Well, that was on purpose. That was
Yeah.
the one the Pat Metheny one.
Somebody call on purpose borrowed fever.
Yeah.
There's some levels of subliminal.
I mean that of course there's no real direct answer to that. I think Igor Stravinsky was asked that question, and he supposedly said, "Good composers borrow, great composers steal."
Picasso said that there are only about 3,500 people who said that.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, but there is no direct answer to that. We're obviously influenced by somebody, otherwise we wouldn't be writing whatever we come up with. I know sometimes when I'm in the middle of a piece and I come up with a good progression, I think to myself, I know I've written that before, but where did it come from? Screw it. So I just wrote it anyway. So
I tell you, the fact that you can say screw it might be your superhero quality. I mean, everybody's an artist in this room, right? Sometimes you just have to, you have to write through the veil of history that hangs over all our heads, right?
I mean, I once heard an interview with another great composer I love, Eino Juhani Rautavaara, who was a great Finnish composer, who always felt that it had to be somewhere before you came out with it when you write it out.
It had to exist already.
It existed somewhere. I don't know if that's true. I question that, but I admire it nonetheless.
I think it has to be true, because if you're a musical person, you're a visual person, you're looking at things, you're hearing sounds, and they're in here somewhere.
Yeah. But if
Nothing's new.
Yeah. I have yet to be, I mean, if I'm going to do anything, as I mentioned in the Pat Metheny piece that I mentioned, that was done deliberately, provided, as I said before, I indicated that I wrote that it's based on a melody by Pat Metheny, so I'm not taking credit for that. But I mean, I believe, I have no idea if surely I'm influenced. I'm sure I can write something that might be comparable to something that I've heard before, but I couldn't tell you. I mean, it makes me think of that stupid situation with what was the Marvin Gaye Foundation that sued that they were after Pharrell and Robin Thicke. They did this song called Blurred Lines. That was the name of it.
Yep.
It resembled too much a Marvin Gaye song, and I listened to them both. The harmonies were different. The only thing that was similar was the groove.
It was the groove.
Yeah. But the harmonies were different, the melody was different, but apparently Robin Thicke owed up paying Marvin Gaye's foundation like $8 million or something, which was ridiculous. I've seen far more closer resemblances between other two songs. Off the top of my head, Warren Zevon's Werewolves of London versus Leonard Skinner's Sweet Home Alabama. Exactly the same tempo, same exact 3-chord harmony that loops. They didn't sue each other.
I was going to say, Charlie, if you were, I could have thought you patented like 1654.
Yeah.
We live in different lives.
I heard that Miles Davis actually tried to copyright a chord.
Good for him.
I tried.
Good for him.
But the music organization said no.
So does anybody else have any questions for Charlie?
I'm curious about more of the practical process part things. I mean, as a composer, finding venues for the work that you actually create must be tricky to navigate at times, yes?
Absolutely. Generally, yes. Although, I remember when I was in Manhattan School of Music, the great composer Ned Rorem did a lecture, and he said the best thing to do, it's better for composers to befriend performers, not so much to befriend other composers. And he was absolutely right, and I remembered that, and that's when I met Christian Yerby and a few other friends who have been influential, and today I work regularly. I mean, as far as chamber music is concerned, I've gotten, I think, almost everything played in New York through two primary groups. One is Access Contemporary Music, which is based in Chicago, but they have their New York times there, and of course Composers Concordance. Every piece, I'm asked every year by them to write something.
So that group has a fantastic premise, which is that everybody who they invite in is a composer, but they're also a competent performer.
Yeah.
You know, and so you wind up with a little bit of that natural situation, right?
Yeah.
So this is a follow-up since you brought up chamber music.
Yeah.
What's your position on the instrument of the viola?
What are you trying to get another viola?
I heard somebody say one time to a bunch of musicians, and there was a viola section, and
Right, like 32 musicians.
they basically said that violas, okay, versus the violins and the bass, were played banana notes, and I had no idea what that meant. But banana notes.
Okay.
So I was often struck by, this was the conductor who was speaking.
Yeah.
You know, it was a high school orchestra. So, but I thought, gee, what, you know, why would you say that? So I often wondered what the position people took professionally on violas for him to, you know.
I've never heard the term banana notes before. I have no idea what that means.
Okay.
It just goes to show you how many local jokes there are about violists. It's a vast ocean.
I mean, I remember there's a story when Dizzy Gillespie was playing in Cab Calloway's big band. You know, at one point he was doing all these famous bizarre riffs from the bebop era, and Cab Calloway says, "What are you doing playing Chinese music for?" I mean, it's like, maybe banana music, you make me think that's like a musical Yogi Berra line.
Yeah.
You know, but as far as viola, I love the viola, obviously. Why it has come to the fact that the jokes came about and that it's less known in comparison to violin or bass or cello, I don't know. But having said that, I must give you my favorite viola joke.
Okay, so that's what he's after.
Yeah. So two violists decide that they're frustrated with their lives and they want to end it. So they climb up a 1,000-foot mountain, they get to the top. One says to the other, "If we jump off together, we will die together." So they jump off in the air, and when they hit the ground, they go, not together.
Okay, that's a good one.
There are a bunch of other stupid jokes, but that's my favorite.
So anyways, if we can, maybe we wrap it up. We're about an hour. But I want to wrap up with a commercial for the concert. So, I will look at the video here. So the Garage at Chatham, which is the organization I'm the music director of, is going to be performing next Saturday, July 13th, up here in Chatham, in Cady Hall on Main Street, Cady's Hall. And it's upstairs above Beanie's, and it's Ellsworth Kelly's old studio. And the program is going to be the Messiaen Quartet for the End of Time. And it's going to be preceded by Charlie Coleman's new piece, the Quartet, for a new start. And it's a bunch of fantastic musicians, and I hope you can join us. The concert is free. It's at 6 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, the wine store, Chatham Wine and Liquor, is providing free wine. And so we can all go into our listening in a slightly inappropriately lubricious state. And with that, I guess I'd like to say thanks, Charlie, thanks a ton for, first of all, I had the jump on you guys. Charlie sent me the score, and one of the things that struck me when I was sort of hacking through it at the piano was like earlier what he talked about was how the ending echoes the beginning, but it's a little bit different. The ending of the piece is it's a beautiful ending track. So yeah, be there for that, and